He was the definition of power and authority, a decorated police chief admired by his community, a man trusted to uphold justice and protect the innocent. But behind the uniform, behind the badge, Jamarcus Henderson carried a darkness that no one could have imagined. To the outside world, he was a devoted father, a man who would do anything for his children. But when a bitter divorce shattered the perfect image he had so carefully crafted, something inside him snapped. It started with resentment, a slow-burning hatred he kept hidden behind forced smiles and public appearances. But resentment has a way of festering, of growing into something much, much worse. No one saw the warning signs. No one suspected a thing, until the unthinkable happened. One moment, two innocent little boys were laughing, playing, enjoying a weekend with their father. The next, they were gone without a trace. A frantic search began. Their mother, desperate for answers, pleaded for their safe return. The entire city held its breath, hoping, praying. And at the center of it all was Jamarcus, the grieving father, the heartbroken man who just wanted his sons back. Cameras captured his anguish. Reporters hung on his every word. But behind the scenes, the truth was far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. What really happened to Kamari and Jalen Henderson? What was their father hiding? And how did one of the city's most respected law enforcement officers become the monster in this tragic story? Before we dive into this shocking case, take a moment to like this video and subscribe for more chilling tales of love, lies, and betrayal. Because this case is one you won't forget. Jamarcus Henderson was a man of power. At 45 years old, he had spent over 2 decades building an untouchable reputation as one of Houston's most formidable police chiefs. He was known as a no-nonsense enforcer of the law, respected by colleagues, feared by criminals. He carried an ironclad reputation of discipline and authority, the kind of man who commanded respect with just a glance. To the public, he was a pillar of justice, a protector of the city. But behind the badge, beneath the crisp uniform and the carefully cultivated image, Jamarcus Henderson was something else entirely. A vengeful, narcissistic man who despised losing control. His biggest humiliation came from the one person he once claimed to love, his ex-wife, Latavia Breland. At 38, Latavia was everything Jamarcus resented in a woman, independent, ambitious, and no longer under his thumb. They had met in high school, back when she was captivated by his confidence, his charm, the way he carried himself like a man destined for greatness. By 20, she was his wife. By 30, she was the mother of his 2 sons, Kamari, now 8, and Jalen, 6. And for a long time, she thought she was living the dream. But Jamarcus was never the loving husband he appeared to be in family photos. He was domineering, possessive, a man who believed control was love. He dictated what Latavia could wear, who she could talk to, how she spent her time. If she stepped out of line, she was met with silence so cold it could freeze her in place. If she questioned him, she was met with words so sharp they cut deeper than any blade. And when that wasn't enough, there were the long nights he simply didn't come home, the unspoken truth lingering in the air like cigarette smoke. For years, Latavia tolerated it. She told herself it was just marriage, just the price she had to pay for the life they built. But everything changed when she saw Jamarcus begin treating their sons the same way. The way his voice cut through the air like a whip, the way Kamari and Jalen flinched when his footsteps grew heavy. The way they feared their own father. That was when she knew, she had to leave. But leaving a man like Jamarcus Henderson was never going to be easy. When she filed for divorce, she didn't just walk away. She exposed him. She laid bare his infidelity, his emotional cruelty, his complete indifference toward their family. And the courts listened. They stripped him of everything, his home, his assets, and most importantly, his control. Latavia was granted full custody of Kamari and Jalen, and Jamarcus was reduced to a weekend father. A visitor in the lives of the children he had once ruled over. To the world, he remained the respected officer, the decorated police chief, the man who had dedicated his life to justice. But inside, the rage was growing, festering like an untreated wound. Because Jamarcus Henderson wasn't the kind of man who accepted defeat. And he certainly wasn't the kind of man who forgave. Their divorce was brutal. A war fought in courtrooms, in whispered accusations, in the sharp glances exchanged when they were forced to be in the same room. Jamarcus Henderson wasn't the type of man to lose, but this time, he had. When the judge awarded Latavia full custody of their two children, 8-year-old Kamari and 6-year-old Jalen, it shattered something inside him. It wasn't just about the children. It was about power. Control. His name, his image, his authority. And Latavia had ripped it all away from him. The humiliation festered. Watching Latavia move on, flourishing as a mother, posting pictures of the kids on social media, dating a new man, living in the home he once controlled, made him seethe with rage. He convinced himself that she was parading her happiness just to spite him. That every laugh, every snapshot of their sons grinning, was a direct attack. And the worst part? The boys looked happy. Happier than they ever did under his roof. He couldn't stand it. If he couldn't have his children, neither could she. That Friday evening, Jamarcus picked up Kamari and Jalen for his scheduled weekend visit, just as the custody agreement dictated. His voice was warm, his smile wide. To them, he was still daddy. The man who once lifted them onto his shoulders, the man they still loved despite everything. They had no idea their father had already decided their fate. He took them to Dave and Buster's, where the boys ran from game to game, eyes bright with excitement, their laughter echoing through the arcade. Jamarcus let them have whatever they wanted, pizza, wings, ice cream. He played the role of the doting father effortlessly. To any bystander, they looked like the perfect family. But Jamarcus wasn't basking in the moment. He was memorizing them. The sound of their voices. The way Jalen's little hand fit in his. The way Kamari's face lit up when he won a game. Because soon, they would be gone. That night, back at his house, he cooked their favorite meal, spaghetti with garlic bread. The scent filled the kitchen, a smell that once brought them comfort. But this time, the sauce held a secret. A lethal dose of rat poison, carefully mixed in, undetectable. He served them their plates, watching closely as they twirled the noodles onto their forks, giggling between bites. He forced himself to smile, to act natural. Within an hour, the change began. Kamari was the first to clutch his stomach, his face contorting in confusion and pain. Then came the whimper, the small cry of, "Daddy. I don't feel good." Jalen followed, his tiny frame shaking as he doubled over, a strangled sob escaping his lips. Then the vomiting, the convulsions. The pain hit them like a freight train, merciless and overwhelming. They screamed, their small hands reaching out for help. For him. Jamarcus didn't move. He sat still, watching as his sons withered before his eyes, as their bodies betrayed them. His fingers wrapped around a glass of whiskey, swirling the amber liquid as Kamari collapsed onto the floor, his breathing ragged. His little voice, barely above a whisper, choked out one last plea, "Daddy, please." But there was no mercy left in Jamarcus Henderson. Jalen tried to crawl toward him, his small hand trembling, desperate for comfort, for love, for anything that made sense in those final moments. Jamarcus just watched. He let them suffer. He let them die in pain. And when it was over, when their tiny bodies lay motionless on the cold floor, he stood up, drained the last of his whiskey, and calmly went to work. He wrapped them in garbage bags with the same cold efficiency he had used at crime scenes throughout his career. He carried them out to his car, stuffing their lifeless forms into the trunk. Then he drove, an hour outside of Houston, where the city lights faded into thick, shadowed woods. He dug a shallow grave. Not deep enough to hide his crime forever, but enough to keep them out of sight. He dumped them inside, their small bodies crumpling together. He covered them with dirt, leaves, anything that would keep them hidden. Then, without a moment of hesitation, he turned and left. Back home, he scrubbed the floors, wiped down the counters, washed away the last traces of their existence. As if they had never been there at all. As if he had never been their father. The next morning, Jamarcus put on his best performance. He knew exactly how this needed to play out, what to say, how to sound, when to let his voice crack just enough to sell the pain. He dialed Latavia's number, pressing the phone to his ear, inhaling deeply as if he were catching his breath after waking up to a nightmare. The second she answered, he let the panic flood his voice. "Tavia, I woke up, and the boys were gone. Someone took them." Latavia's scream cut through the receiver, raw and terrified. "What do you mean gone? Where are my babies, Jamarcus?" His breathing hitched, and he made sure to sound as frantic as possible. "I don't know. I fell asleep, and when I woke up, the front door was open. They're not here, Tavia. They're gone." The phone clattered on her end, followed by the sound of her sobbing. Jamarcus squeezed his eyes shut, a smirk threatening to curl his lips. This was the moment he had been waiting for. Within hours, an Amber Alert was issued. The Houston Police Department, the very agency that once revered Jamarcus as one of their finest, launched an all-out search for Kamari and Jalen. Squad cars canvassed the city, helicopters hovered over wooded areas, and officers combed through neighborhoods, stopping anyone who might have seen something. The media latched onto the story instantly. "Have you seen Kamari and Jalen Calloway?" flashed across news screens, their innocent, smiling faces staring back at millions. Jamarcus played the grieving father to perfection. He stood before cameras, his broad shoulders hunched, his face twisted in anguish. "Please, if anyone has my boys, bring them home. I just want my babies back." His voice cracked, his eyes welled with tears, tears he had mastered producing on demand. Latavia was inconsolable. She collapsed into his arms during the press conference, shaking violently with grief. In front of flashing cameras, he held her, whispering empty reassurances as she sobbed against his chest. "We're gonna find them, Tavia. We have to believe that." The city rallied behind them. Community members formed search parties, scouring parks, alleyways, and abandoned buildings. Volunteers passed out flyers, their faces hopeful, unaware that the man standing beside them, pretending to search, had buried the children they were looking for. But cracks in his story appeared quickly. There was no forced entry. No signs of a struggle. A neighbor's security camera faced his front door, and yet, no one was seen entering or leaving with the boys. It didn't add up. Then investigators seized his laptop. And there it was, the unraveling of his carefully constructed lie. His search history told a chilling tale. How long does rat poison take to kill? Easiest way to dispose of a body. How to stage a child abduction. The walls around him began to close in. Jamarcus could feel it. The whispers. The side glances from his fellow officers. The shift in the way they looked at him, not as their respected former chief, but as something else. Something monstrous. For the first time, the hunter was becoming the hunted. The break came in the most damning way possible. It started with a search of Jamarcus's car. Investigators had combed through it once before, but this time, they brought in cadaver dogs. The moment the doors opened, the dogs reacted violently, whining, barking, pawing at the trunk. The scent of death lingered, unmistakable. The officers exchanged knowing glances, their stomachs twisting with the realization. Then came the GPS records. Jamarcus had always been meticulous, careful, calculated, but even he couldn't erase digital footprints. His car's tracking system told the story he had tried so desperately to conceal. The night Kamari and Jalen disappeared, his vehicle had been parked for over an hour in a desolate wooded area, miles away from his home. It was the missing piece. The evidence was undeniable. There was no more room for deception, no more performances to play. When detectives confronted him in the interrogation room, laying everything bare, the cadaver dogs, the GPS records, the internet searches, Jamarcus Henderson, the once proud police chief, cracked. His face remained expressionless as he leaned back in his chair, staring at the table. And then, in a voice devoid of remorse, he said the words that would haunt everyone in that room. "I'll take you to them." The drive to the burial site was silent. Jamarcus sat in the back seat of the squad car, hands cuffed in his lap, staring out the window as if this were just another patrol. The officers beside him didn't speak, their jaws clenched, fury simmering beneath their skin. This was their former leader, a man they had admired, a man they had once trusted. And now, he was a monster leading them to the bodies of his own children. The moment they arrived, the smell hit them first. The sickening stench of decomposition, clinging to the air, thick and suffocating. Jamarcus stepped out of the car, calm, detached, as if he were leading them to misplaced evidence instead of the corpses of his sons. He pointed to a patch of disturbed earth beneath a cluster of trees. There. The digging began. Shovels cut through the dirt, heavy and relentless, and then, a small, lifeless hand emerged from the soil. Gasps rippled through the officers, and one of them turned away, swallowing back bile. The digging quickened, hands replacing shovels, clawing through the dirt. Kamari and Jalen's tiny bodies lay huddled together, their skin pale, their faces frozen in agony. It was as if even in death, they had clung to each other for comfort. The forensic team worked methodically, but there was no preparing for the horror they uncovered. The boys had suffered. The autopsy later confirmed what investigators already suspected: rat poison. It had shut down their organs slowly, painfully. Their last moments had been nothing but pure agony. When Latavia received the call, she let out a sound so primal, so guttural, that her neighbors ran to her house, fearing something had happened. She collapsed to the floor, clutching her stomach, her body shaking violently. She had spent days clinging to hope, praying her babies were out there, alive, waiting for her. Now, that hope was dead. Her babies were gone. Jamarcus was arrested that same evening. And not just anywhere, at his own police station. His fellow officers watched in grim silence as he was pulled from the interrogation room, his hands shackled behind his back. The man they had once saluted was now a disgrace, a murderer being led out of the very precinct he once commanded. He didn't fight. Didn't resist. He walked with his head high, as if still believing he was in control. But the world would see him for what he truly was. By the time his mugshot was released, it spread like wildfire. The proud, respected police chief of Houston was now a child killer. His name, once synonymous with law and order, was now drenched in blood. There was no redemption. No coming back from this. Jamarcus Henderson had lost everything. And the world would make sure he paid for it. The trial of Jamarcus Henderson was one of the most watched in Texas history. The once respected police chief, now a child murderer, sat at the defendant's table, shackled and emotionless. His navy blue suit, neatly pressed, was a desperate attempt to mask the monster beneath. But no suit, no courtroom etiquette, could erase the horror of what he had done. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity: reporters, grieving mothers, community leaders, former officers who once worked under him but now looked at him with nothing but disgust. The tension was suffocating. The air itself felt heavy with rage, sorrow, and the desperate need for justice. And then came Latavia. She walked to the witness stand, her body trembling but her eyes burning with fury. She had spent months drowning in grief, waking up in cold sweats, hearing the ghostly echoes of her babies crying for help. But today, she would not cry. Today, she would speak. She looked Jamarcus dead in the eyes, the man she had once loved, the man who had fathered her children, the man who had butchered them. Her voice was steady but filled with a pain so raw, so unbearable, that the courtroom fell silent. "He didn't just kill my babies," she said, her voice thick with rage. "He tortured them. He made sure they suffered. And he did it just to hurt me." Jamarcus didn't flinch. He didn't look away. But for the first time, the mask slipped. His lips tightened, his jaw clenched. Latavia's hands gripped the edge of the witness stand as she continued. "They trusted him. They loved him. And he poisoned them like they were nothing." Kamari begged for his life. Jalen reached for his father, and he let them die in agony. "I want this court to know, this man didn't just take my children. He took my soul. He took my reason for living. And I will never, ever forgive him." Her words weren't just testimony. They were a mother's war cry. The prosecution built their case with brutal precision. They showed the jury photos of Kamari and Jalen, not just of their smiling faces before their deaths, but their bodies as they were found. The images were horrifying. The small, frail limbs, the twisted expressions frozen in agony, the undeniable proof of pure, calculated evil. They walked the jury through his internet searches. How long does rat poison take to kill? How to stage a child abduction? They played his 911 call. The fake panic in his voice now rang hollow, pathetic, revolting. Jamarcus's defense team tried to argue insanity. They painted a picture of a man overcome with grief from losing custody, a man not in his right mind. They brought in psychologists, experts, anyone who could suggest that perhaps, just maybe, he hadn't truly known what he was doing. But the prosecution shredded that argument apart. He knew exactly what he was doing, one forensic psychologist testified. This was not an impulsive act. This was planned. Calculated. He watched those children suffer, and he did nothing. That is not insanity. That is pure malice. The trial gripped the nation. Parents wept at home, unable to fathom how a father, a man sworn to protect and serve, could commit such an unspeakable act. On social media, people demanded the harshest sentence possible. Some states still had the death penalty, and many believed Jamarcus deserved it. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned, the courtroom held its breath. Jamarcus sat stone-faced, as if already knowing his hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. You will spend every single remaining day of your life behind bars, knowing that the world will remember you not as a police chief, not as a father, but as a child killer. There will be no appeals, no second chances, no escape. Even in his prison cell, Jamarcus remained bitter and unrepentant. He expected Latavia to visit, to look him in the eyes one last time, to let him know he still had power over her. But she never did. She refused to give him the satisfaction. Instead, on the anniversary of their deaths, she stood at Kamari and Jalen's gravesite, whispering to her babies, promising them that their father would never take another breath of freedom again. Jamarcus, once a powerful police chief, now spent his days in a cold, gray cell, surrounded by men who had no respect for child killers. Forgotten by the world, stripped of his badge, and forever haunted by the cries of the children he had betrayed, he lived the rest of his days knowing that no one would ever mourn the man who once called himself Big J. This case is a harrowing reminder of how unchecked anger and control can lead to unimaginable tragedy. Jamarcus Henderson, once a respected leader, a man who wore a badge and vowed to protect his community, became the very monster he once swore to fight. He wasn't just a father, he was a police chief, a figure of authority, someone trusted to uphold justice. And yet, in the end, he became the worst kind of criminal. He looked into his children's eyes and chose revenge over love. He fed them poison, knowing it would be slow, knowing they would suffer, knowing they would cry out for him. And he did nothing. Kamari and Jalen weren't just his sons, they were boys full of life, innocence, and trust. They never saw it coming. How could they? Their father was supposed to be their protector. Instead, he was their executioner. And for what? Because he wanted to hurt Latavia? Because his pride couldn't handle the idea of another man raising his children? What drives a person to such depths of cruelty that they no longer see their own flesh and blood as human beings, but as weapons? Jamarcus Henderson will never walk free again. He will rot behind bars, knowing that the world will remember him not as a leader, not as a father, but as a monster. But justice, no matter how swift, cannot undo what he did. It cannot bring back the laughter of two little boys whose lives were stolen far too soon. What do you think? What truly drove Jamarcus to commit such an unthinkable crime? Was it pure evil, or was his pride so fragile that he saw his own children as nothing more than tools for revenge? If this story shocked you, like and subscribe for more cases that expose the darkest corners of love, lies, and betrayal. Because sometimes, the people we trust the most are the ones hiding the deadliest secrets.